The main thing that I knew I really wanted to do when I was designing the cover is that I wanted it to be simple. I didn't want to have any kind of illustration or action sequence playing out on the cover. I like very clean covers. Everyone always says don't judge a book by a cover, but they do. And you've got about 3 seconds to grab people's attention and say, you know, come over here, read the book, it's good, you'll like it. I didn't want anyone's faces. I'm not fond of having people's faces on the cover because everyone's going to have a different idea of what they consider beautiful or ugly. And I think if you slap a face on the cover, it kind of robs the reader of being able to create that image in their head. The first thing that really popped up in my mind was the image of a thistle and a jasmine, which was an image I had fairly early on, and if you read the book you kind of know why that's quite an important symbol for the book. I had a look around where I could find local flowers that would work for that. As it turns out, my mum has jasmine flowers growing in her garden. I managed to find a few local growing thistles. At the time they weren't really grown, they were all in the bud stage, but another few weeks and they would have been in bloom. But in the end I decided I wasn't going to go for that route because it was more appropriate for the second book. And as much as I love the idea, it didn't quite work. It didn't pop up enough in the storyline for the first book, so I thought, no, leave that for the second. While I'd been writing the book, one of the things that I did is I carried a notebook like this around with me, and whenever I got ideas or kind of notes, I would pop it in this book. I'd done my rough ideas of what I wanted for the cover, which was these. Eventually I decided, after I'd done quite a few read-throughs to try and figure out what image popped up the most, I decided that Astrid's veil was the thing which popped up the most, along with her hood. I did really want to add her hood onto the cover and have her veil and then the wolf hood over it, and for her to kind of be hollow so you don't see her face, so it looks like it's over an invisible person. I'd had a look at finding fake wolf skins, but there was nothing that I could find that looked remotely realistic, and I could possibly have made one, but it would have taken ages and I just didn't have the time to devote 2 weeks or a month to just doing this. So I thought, no, because it could also clutter the image as well, let's stick to the veil. The veil pops up a lot more than Astrid's wolf skin. I decided that a pashmina would be perfect for the cover, just a simple pashmina. The main thing I was worried about when I bought the pashmina is that it would be very flat, and I knew that I'd be photographing on a black background, and what worried me is that I'd photograph it and having the black background and then a black veil in front, they might merge into each other, so I knew I'd have to be quite careful with the lighting. When I actually got the pashmina, it had quite a lot of nice texture to it, and I ended up getting 3 different pashminas because I knew I was probably going to end up cutting some to do either the lip scar or the scars down the side of her face. So I thought, get spares, that way if you end up cutting up a few, you have backups if you decide you want to go back and have just a simple pashmina. One of the other things that I also dabbled with was the idea that I might possibly gild the edges of the veil, which go just over this part of her face. But when I was thinking through it, apart from the fact that that's not mentioned in the book at all, it's not something Astrid would have done. She went through very dangerous areas and she was there to protect people, so the last thing you want to do is draw attention to yourself, especially in areas where there's a very big possibility of you getting robbed. You don't wear something that's gilded, that's just asking for trouble. So I decided to completely dump the idea of having any kind of gilded edges on the veil. The first thing I had to do was to make some kind of mould or cast that the pashmina would be able to go over. It was meant to look hollow, so I either had to spray paint my face cast or fiddle with it digitally, and I wanted to do as little digital manipulation as possible with this. I knew that I wanted the photo to be as close to perfect as I could possibly get before I took it into Photoshop and started fiddling. What I did instead is I got tape and cut it up into tiny little pieces and then stuck it over the cast till I had a shape which covered up the lower half of the mouth, from the nose all the way down to the chin. After that it was smoothing it out. We didn't want any edges because otherwise it was going to press up against the pashmina and you wouldn't be able to see it. So I smoothed out all the edges, then I pulled it off the face cast and also put little bits of tape along the inside so that I'd be able to hold it without it sticking to my fingers. Then I took some board and cut out the shape and taped the edges to that because otherwise it was going to lose its shape. It could, flatten, or something could become distorted, and it would also make it a lot easier for me to prop it up on something to photograph. So I taped it onto the back of the board and cut a V shape into the back, because otherwise what was going to happen is when the camera was at the level of the face, you might be able to end up seeing the back. And I didn't want to see the back, and not to mention anything I pegged it with was also going to be in view. So I cut a V shape so that I could peg it further down and so you wouldn't see it once the pashmina was draped over it. The original ideas that I had was to also try and include just a simple black hood. I found out that my mum had some spare chicken wire in her shed, so I thought, okay, let's use this and we'll make a frame. I spent quite a few hours, at least an hour doing this, cutting it out, folding the wire so that it held into place, figuring out what was the size that was kind of appropriate for my head, because I'd based the front part of the mask on my face. I had to also base it on my head size as well, so that it looked proportionate. I didn't want this quite big face and then this tiny little constricted hood. I did want it to go quite far out. What I used to prop it up and what I used to photograph everything was the light stand for one of my soft boxes. So I just popped that in the middle of the room, had it far away enough from the background so that you couldn't really see the backdrop, or at least you couldn't see the texture on the backdrop, and then pinned the face cast onto the pole, and that was quite tricky because it kept slipping, and eventually I figured out that I needed to peg it at an angle so that it wouldn't slip off and fall down. And I also ended up having to stuff the inside of the face cast, otherwise it was too flimsy and it kind of flopped about. So I just took plastic bags and stuffed it inside to give it a bit of shape. In the end, what happened is I didn't end up using the wire frame that I'd made. It just didn't look right, and I would have had the camera so far away to take the shot that it would have just looked a bit odd, and I knew that I wanted something which was very close up. So even though I'd spent quite a lot of time working on this, I thought, no, it doesn't work, we're going to have to scrap it. So I scrapped that idea, which was a little bit heartbreaking, and then spent about the next 40 minutes trying to get the pashmina to hang right, because I needed it to kind of be pulled in one direction so it was like a face was pressing against it like this. And it took ages trying to pin it into the right place so that it would follow the shape of the nose and follow the shape of the mouth. And for the lips, one of the things I had to do is put a little bit of blue tack underneath and then press the veil against it so that it would follow the shape of the mouth and you could see the shape of the lips. I think in total I took around 73 images for that. The first few were completely rubbish. It was trying to get the lighting right, figuring out how I wanted the lighting, what shape I wanted the face to be, chuck ideas around, and eventually the best idea bubbles to the surface. I had wanted a scar shape to be across the lips, but what happened is while I was taking the photos there was a crease on one of the pashminas, and it just turned out that it fell in such a way that it looked like the scars Astrid has on the right side of her face. So I thought, that's perfect. And I had been considering creating another crease right down the centre of her lips, but the thing that worried me about doing that is that it might make it look like I'd just taken a crinkled piece of cloth and slapped it over a face cast. So I thought, don't do that. You don't need to bombard the viewer with a ton of information. You just need something extremely basic. You don't need to try and shove in every single backstory into the cover. Just whittle it down to the basics. You don't necessarily need to see the shape of the scar on the lips. Let's just leave the scar on the face. So I did that. One of the biggest problems, apart from doing the cover took a long time, but it was pretty straightforward once I knew what I was actually doing. One of the most tricky things for me for the cover was figuring out what font I wanted, because font is important. Font is very, very important, and I spent ages looking at all these different fonts, what I already had, and eventually I decided on a font called Berliner. I can't remember what the whole name of it was. But it was a beautiful Gothic font, and it was exactly what I wanted. I wanted something which was a serif font, and it was just ideal. How I wanted it, what size did I want it, what colour did I want it, did I want a tiny little bit of a gold outline, you know, did I want light reflecting on it in some areas, did I wanted it to look like it being chiselled out of rock. It was all these little details. The two things that happened is there were two covers that I wasn't sure about. There was one where you just see kind of this part of the face, and then there was one where you also get to see kind of the gap here, and you get to see that the veil that's over this person, the person is hollow. And at first I wasn't sure about it because I was worried people might look at that and think, you know, what's going on here? But then I decided that's what I want. You know, I want people to look at this and go, what's going on there? And then, you know, they pick up the book and then they read the blurb, and then hopefully they read the blurb and decide, you know, I might like this book. So in the end, I went for the second one. I thought it looked a lot better. I was worried that the first one, where I had kind of just the bottom bit of the face, just looked, it didn't look finished, it didn't look right, and the second one just looked right. So after that, that's pretty much how I did the cover. It took ages to do, but in the end I was really happy with it. And if you want to see the book, or if you want to read the book, I've got the link to that down in the description box. and I'll have a new video for you next week.